Hi, everybody. Welcome to Making the Grade. I'm Michelle Edmonds from Idaho News 6. So nice to have you live with us if you're joining us on Facebook right now. As always, we love to take your thoughts and questions and comments on anything regarding education in the state of Idaho. Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News joining me to talk again on this Tuesday morning. And Kevin, we have a number of ways to go about this. I mean, schools are getting back into the classroom in Idaho. Oh my goodness, it's been a year, and yet the Idaho legislature is not going back to class yet. So let's start with the kids, who a lot of parents, including myself, dropped kids off today and said, wow, this is an actual real situation. There's like lots of people in the parking lot and it is crowded again at the schools. Is this happening across the state of Idaho? Are kids back in the classroom?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we've been tracking this all year long, and what we're seeing is that really only a handful of schools are not back in some form, and most are back in at least full-time or close to full-time face-to-face instruction. And yeah, as you mentioned, big districts in the Treasure Valley just coming out of spring break this week: West Ada, Boise, Nampa, and you're seeing, in West Ada and Boise especially, you're seeing an expansion of the face-to-face instruction.
So I have to ask you, how are coronavirus cases being tracked? And obviously, it is going to be a tougher scenario, I would assume, as more and more kids are coming together. Is the State Department expecting a rise in the number of coronavirus cases? I know many school districts are still trying to take some precautions at least, but I saw, let's say, zero social distancing this morning.
It's a tough go to get kids to social distance, right? I mean, that's going to be one of the challenges. And really, what we're going to watch these next few weeks is what we see in the K-12 case numbers. Let's talk about the numbers that we saw in this latest report. As you know, Health and Welfare issues this report every Monday. It takes you from Monday through Sunday of the previous week. And the numbers last week, the numbers that came out yesterday, are pretty good. As you look at the bar chart, we're down to 71 new cases in the K-12 system reported last week. And that is the lowest number we've seen since that first report, since Health and Welfare issued its first report in October. Now, a big caveat here: as we know, a lot of the big school districts around the state were on spring break: West Ada, Boise, Nampa, Bonneville, Idaho Falls, on down the list. So it would stand to reason that the numbers last week might be a little bit lower, simply because school was not in session, kids were not in class, so you didn't have as many cases involving students or staff. Let's watch what these numbers do in the next few weeks, because if you look at that bar chart, what we've seen really for the past 2 months, pretty steady numbers. At or a little bit above maybe 100, or a little bit below 100 new cases every week. Let's see if that number holds for the rest of the school year as students are spending more time in the classroom. That's going to be the big test.
I don't think anybody would argue with the fact that educators, parents, administrators, school boards, legislators, pretty much everybody has wanted kids back in class in some form or fashion, as safely as possible, of course. So, Kevin, the question then becomes, who has control over what happens with the closing of schools if that needs to happen?
Well, that's ultimately going to fall to the school boards and the school districts. That's kind of how this has unfolded the past few months. And when we get to talking about the legislature, we're going to talk about that balance, that separation of powers issue that we've seen unfolding at the legislative session all year. But even before the legislature came to town and wanted to assert that school boards and school districts should be making those decisions locally, that's kind of what's been happening this school year. So if you don't want to see it, but if you were to see an increase in cases at the local level, it would be up to those school boards and those trustees and those administrators to come together and figure out what to do next.
And some school boards, too, as we have reported in the past few months, have even given their superintendents some of that power. They've given the shift of power to, if they need to close a school in particular instead of closing down a whole district. So it really is being studied and done at the local level, but that starts with the trustees on school boards making those types of decisions.
And contrast that to where we were a year ago last week, when the state essentially closed all public schools for the balance of the school year. Now we have most schools open, and the decision about whether to keep them open is going to be made at the local level.
Let's move to college campuses, because you and the folks at Idaho Ed News have been tracking since the beginning the number of coronavirus cases on college campuses. And those numbers have waffled, obviously, as the pandemic has waffled and kind of mirrored the communities that they are in for the most part. But not only do we have new numbers to show, but Kevin, as you have been reporting, there are some new fall plans that are now out for some of Idaho's higher education institutions.
Right, and I think it's a little bit of the same thing that we're talking about with K-12. You know, the move towards trying to get school open more like normal, trying to get college campuses open more like normal. You've had Idaho State University and Lewis Clark State College in the past couple of weeks say that their hope is that with the vaccines, with the wide availability of vaccines, that they can return to more of a normal campus environment for the fall. And we've talked a lot, and there's been a lot of coverage about what's been going on with the vaccines and the vaccine availability. That is, that's something that could really make a difference in terms of what colleges and universities can offer in the fall, because we're talking about August. We're talking about 4 months away, and that's a lot of time for this vaccine rollout to continue and to continue in the direction that it's going, where there seems to be more and more availability, more and more people getting in to get their vaccines. So, what we're seeing in April with these colleges and universities offering kind of a mix of face-to-face and online learning, they're hoping to shift back more towards face-to-face with the vaccine helping to make that easier and safer.
Kevin, I got to show you. Susan is just giving us a comment here, and I'm not sure what she is necessarily woo-hooing here, whether that's that schools are open or that vaccines are available or that maybe we are starting to get back to some sort of normalcy on some of the college campuses. But Susan, we hear you. I should give a shout out to a woo-hoo on any of those things, because Kevin, literally, it's been a year of us doing this and having everybody do this. So it's going to be fascinating as we look to the future of what happened during the pandemic for our kids' sake. We talk about mental health and stress and seniors in high school who now may actually be thinking about going to college next year, whereas we've kind of lost a group of seniors from the 2020 class who perhaps took a gap year, may never go back. There are so many variables that this pandemic has brought into the education world that we are going to have to continue to cover for a decade.
Yes, really a lot that we're going to have to process at the K-12 and the higher education level about what this has meant in terms of student success, in terms of student outcomes. That's a project I'm working on this spring and this fall, looking at higher education, looking at enrollment, but also looking at, what are the student stories? What are the case studies behind those numbers? So yes, a lot that we're going to have to sort out from this past year. But let's at the same time keep an eye on the moment and keep an eye on what's happening with these numbers. I mean, yes, I've been doing this for a year. I've been tracking case numbers for a year. I've got spreadsheets upon spreadsheets upon spreadsheets on my computer, and it will be a nice time when we can stop having to track the numbers. But I think it's really important at this point. What we're seeing in Idaho right now with the case numbers and the vaccine numbers, right now, a lot of these trends are pretty good. Case numbers overall, and now we're not just talking about K-12 or higher ed, we're talking about the overall population. Case numbers have been pretty steady, not a huge increase in new cases, unlike what we're seeing in a lot of other states, by the way. Right now, the Idaho numbers look fairly stable. They're not going down. The case numbers aren't going down, but they also aren't going up like they are in numerous states. And those numbers of vaccinations are increasing. There's another record number of vaccinations administered last week. So Yeah, we're going to keep tracking these numbers because we're at a critical juncture here between the vaccine rollouts and the concerns about new variants of the coronavirus. So we're not done tracking numbers yet.
Well, we appreciate your spreadsheets and sharing all of your knowledge with us, because it's not exactly the most fun thing to track, pandemic related case numbers. But it's vital and important for all of our safety and for our kids' safety. Kevin,
and what we've tried to do, with these numbers for a year is, I've said this before and I'll say it again, we're not trying to alarm people with the numbers. We're also not trying to give people a false sense of hope. I mean, if the numbers are trending in the wrong direction, we report that. If the numbers are trending in the right direction, as we've seen with some of these metrics lately, we'll report that as well.
I agree. I like what you guys are doing. It's very helpful to all of us. Let me switch gears on you. This is a topic that you and I have not covered here on Making the Grade, although Idaho Education News, Idaho News 6 have been following this story. And I just kind of wanted to bring our viewers and listeners into the loop on the tort claim that came out from Big City Coffee versus Boise State. So before we jump into the most recent information that just happened, can you back us up just a tiny bit, Kevin, in case people don't understand what's going on, and say, why is a coffee shop upset with Boise State?
Okay, so this controversy really started to flare up back in the summer and the fall. Big City Coffee, a local coffee shop, got a contract to take over a shop location on the Boise State campus. I think it's in the library, and it had been a Starbucks. So, Boise State changed the vendor. They went to Big City Coffee. There was a good deal of controversy surrounding that decision. And according to the tort claim, you had this controversy basically starting to flare up even last summer, even before the start of the school year. Student groups concerned about a Big City Coffee as a campus vendor, citing the ownership's vocal support of law enforcement. And this all kind of came to a head in October, when, depending on who you believe here, either Big City Coffee opted out or asked to opt out of its contract to remain on the campus, or, as Big City Coffee alleges in this tort claim, they were essentially forced off of the campus. And what you have with the tort claim is Big City Coffee claiming that they were forced off of campus, they were not made aware of the controversy surrounding their contract, even as the company was putting money into setting up its location, taking out loans to open up its shop on campus. So now you have Big City Coffee filing a tort claim, and a tort claim is not a lawsuit. It's a precursor to a lawsuit, and saying that if this issue remains unresolved, they will file a civil suit, or could file a civil suit and seek in excess of $10 million of damage. And, this is another chapter in an ongoing debate about Boise State, and an ongoing controversy about Boise State, with critics saying that the university and the university administration is pushing a social justice agenda, and that Big City Coffee, in this case, was caught in the crossfire of that social justice movement. We'll see how this sorts out. We'll see what Boise State does in the way of a response to the lawsuit. They haven't commented on the lawsuit. We'll see if the university files a response, and I believe they have 60 days to respond in legal filings. So we'll see what happens from here.
Well, and this just bleeds over into what the legislature still has to deal with. Of course, the legislature took its own recess, a pause, as they talked about, because of coronavirus spreading through the State House a couple of weeks ago. And they're on this pause, expected to come back to the State House to finish business a week from today on April 6th. And why I say that this bleeds over is because there are still education budgets that need to be passed, specifically for higher education. And Kevin, you and I have talked about over the last couple of months here that Boise State is in the crossfires of some of the higher education debate when it comes to how to fund them because of these perceived social justice issues on campus.
Yeah, so let's go back to pre-recess. So pre-recess, the legislature's budget committee wrote up a higher education spending plan that took $400,000, $409,000 to be exact, from Boise State University, siphons that money to Lewis Clark State College. And what the budget committee is saying that it's doing here is that it's taking $409,000 that Boise State was spending on social justice programs. That budget, as written, passed the Senate right before the recess, a couple of days before the recess, passed the Senate fairly comfortably. That's not necessarily too surprising. And what really bears watching, when the legislature does come back from recess, this budget still has to pass the House. The House is a good deal more conservative. The House voted down a couple of higher education budgets a year ago before finally settling on an amount. I think it's anybody's guess what happens with this budget when it gets over to the House and whether it passes, or if it's voted down, then you have to write up a new version of the budget, and that's going to slow down the legislature's path through adjournment. That's a big budget, and it's not the only big budget that the legislature has to deal with when they get back to town. Neither house has taken up the K-12 budgets yet, so that's still got to get through both the House and the Senate. We expect we'll see, well, we will see, it's already been written, another bill that would address that early education grant, that federal grant that the House rejected back in early March. There's a new bill to address that. We'll see if that gets through both houses and authorizes the State Board of Education to proceed with this federal grant and proceed with some early education community pilot projects. And even beyond the budgets, you've got a lot of education policy issues that are still hanging out. Anything from all-day kindergarten to sex education to guns in schools to grants for parents to help offset the costs of online instruction. I mean, there is a lot still to be done, and really hard to tell what kind of approach the legislature is going to take when they come back next week. Will it be kind of a stripped down approach where they pass the budgets that they have to do? Do they take on tax relief, which is an issue a lot of legislators want to tackle? Do they take on transportation, another issue that a lot of legislators want to tackle? And what happens with all of these other issues that are sort of in the pipeline? Do they make their way through and reach the governor's desk, or do they kind of fall by the wayside as the legislature tries to adjourn for the year? Really fascinating process. We've never seen anything quite like this.
I was going to say unprecedented is the correct word,
Yeah.
the correct word here for this, because
really, we use that word way too often, but this really is unprecedented. I mean, we've seen recesses in the legislature before. You have to go back 20 or so years to think of an example, but this late in the session, this close to adjournment, when there are so many issues that were unresolved, we've never seen anything quite like this. So it's an interesting political science experiment, and we'll see how it unfolds starting a week from today.
Have you heard, are any of the legislators trying to make moves from home? Are they doing work from home, or is this a true pause?
I think it depends on the legislator. I talked to a couple last week. Wendy Horman, a Republican from Idaho Falls, she's one of the sponsors of that bill that we've talked about in the past that would create a grant program. It's kind of like the Strong Families grant program that the governor put together a year ago. This would continue that grant program. When I talked to Representative Horman, she said, "Yeah, I'm working the phones. I mean, we're told that we're in pause, that we're going to come back and do all of this. So yes, I'm trying to make the case to my colleagues that this is a big deal and we have to get this resolved." Then I talked to Senator Carl Crabtree from Grangeville. He's one of the co-sponsors of this all-day kindergarten bill, and I asked him, "Well, what are you doing behind the scenes?" And when I called him, this is such Idaho legislature anecdote. When I called him, he was on his cell phone. He was on the Camas Prairie running cattle, and he said, "I think we're just sick of each other. I think legislators are just tired of each other. We need a pause." I'm really not working the phones very much. So very different approaches. We will see. We will see how any of these bills get resolved, or if they're left behind and dealt with in 2022.
working the cattle instead of working the phones. I love that.
And I think his point was, look, I think we all need a break from each other, but that break will come to an end in a week, and there is a lot that we'll be keeping an eye on when the legislature returns to town.
Kevin, let's just touch on one of those bills that's in the pipeline, because it could change the face of education in the state of Idaho, and that is the all-day kindergarten bill. So there is a proposal to allow school districts to use state money to pay for all-day kindergarten, because right now, first of all, kindergarten is not required in the state of Idaho, and secondly, the state only pays for a half day. So why is this so important to such different groups here? And I'm talking specifically about Idaho Business for Education, the nonprofit that works with business partners. You're seeing Republicans on board with this bill. You're seeing some Democrats having some thoughts on it. So what is it about kindergarten and perhaps funding all-day kindergarten that could be historic?
I think what you have going on here is a couple of big trends. First of all, I think there's a big trend towards an emphasis on early learning and an emphasis on early literacy skills. And I think you're seeing more legislators and definitely more business leaders and more education leaders saying the more time kids can spend getting quality instruction, getting quality classroom instruction, especially in pre-reading, pre-literacy at the kindergarten level, the more time that these kids can have in front of a quality teacher, the better off they're going to be down the road. So I think there's a real understanding, a real consensus behind the idea that the more we can do to intervene and help kids, especially kids who are at risk of falling behind in reading, the better off we're going to be down the road. The second thing is, it's not like all-day kindergarten is a new concept or something that isn't happening in Idaho. You've got all-day kindergarten going on in a lot of communities. The question is, how do you pay for it? And as you mentioned, and you broke it down really, really succinctly there, the state will pay a school district to offer half-day kindergarten. If a school district wants to do more than that, they have to figure out how to pay for it. And in many cases, what that means is districts having to go back to voters and say, if you will pass the supplemental levy, we will use that money for 1 to 2 years, because that's the extent, that's the lifespan of a supplemental levy. We'll use that money for a year or two to provide all-day kindergarten. So I think you have legislators, and fairly conservative legislators, pushing this idea of state-funded all-day kindergarten because they want to get that funding, they want to get that cost off of the property tax. They want to take that off of the shoulders of local property owners. So you have a couple of big trends going on here that are coming together to make this all-day kindergarten debate much more salient. Now, it's really late in the legislative session, and this is a big deal. So I'm not sure it actually gets passed this year. It's got a long way to go to get through both houses. But the fact that we're having this discussion is significant.
Well, you're seeing legislators see it as a win-win then. They get a tax cut and they get to help children, who, especially those who may need it with early literacy skills. Do you, Kevin, see this as a potential win for Governor Brad Little?
He hasn't weighed in as much about this particular all-day kindergarten proposal, but he's been very clear about his commitment on early learning and his commitment on early literacy. So I think what you're seeing talked about with all-day kindergarten really does fit nicely into what he's been talking about in terms of early literacy.
Well, we will continue to watch it all unfold a week from today. As they come back, the legislators come back. Again, we have no idea on the timeline. And as if you have heard us talk on Making the Grade for years now, Kevin and I love to have little side bets on, when's the legislature going to actually wrap up, sine die. And oh, goodness gracious, there is no crystal ball, literally, for this year.
Yeah, I've heard anything right now from maybe 2 weeks to maybe 3 weeks. I talked to Senator Chuck Winderer, Senate President Pro Tem. I spoke to him on Monday. He said that his hope is to be done by the 16th. That would be about a 2-week return. We'll see. I mean, I'm also hearing people saying, well, it's going to take more like 3 weeks. We could be in session until the end of April. So, It's funny because when the legislature recessed, Senator Winder went on the floor of the Senate and said, we were kind of hoping we'd get our work done here, and we were kind of hoping maybe to be done with one more week of work. Well, it's not going to be 1 week. It's going to take probably 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks for them to finish their work. And that's assuming that things go smoothly. We don't know how smoothly it's going to go. And we're also assuming that what we saw with these coronavirus cases at the State House, that this 2-week self-isolation, if you will, that's going to take care of the problems, and that people will be able to work safely in the State House. We don't know. I mean, nobody wants to see another outbreak like we saw that final week before the recess, but we don't know what's going to happen with that either.
And we'll be watching it all, most definitely. Mm-hmm. And if you want to be listening to it all, Kevin's got a new podcast. I'm so excited, Kevin, because it's not exactly brand new, because this is something you have been doing a podcast for, I don't even know how long now, but it's gotten renamed, revisioned, partly because you lost your partner in crime, but that's a good thing.
So yes, we've been podcasting here at Idaho Ed News for about 5 years, and Clark Corbin and I co-hosted that podcast for 5 years. I think we did the math. It was 246 episodes that we did, and most of them were Clark and I talking about the week's events and having this ongoing dialogue. It's going to be a little bit different. We're going to launch it this week. It's going to be a little bit more driven with interviews with newsmakers, whether it's folks in the political arena or the education arena or the academic community. And also some fellow journalists I'll bring in from time to time to break down what's happening. I mentioned Senator Winder. I interviewed him on Monday for the podcast this week. So we'll drop that on Friday, and we'll do this every week. The hope that I have here is to provide really one good interview every week where we kind of break down some issues and go into a little bit of the stories behind the stories with folks who are on the inside, whether that's in the inside of the State House or the inside in the classrooms or on campuses. And I'm open to suggestions. If you feel like there's a topic that we should take on the podcast, people want to hear from in the podcast, by all means, let me know.
So people can find this where, Kevin?
Lots of places to find it. We will have a link to it on our homepage, and the podcast will be embedded on the homepage every Friday. But you can also find us over SoundCloud. You can subscribe to us there. I'll send out the links on Facebook and Twitter every week as well. So there are a lot of different ways to find our podcast.
It's a great idea. Great idea dropping on Friday. It's some good running podcasting listening to for me for Saturday morning. So that's perfect. I really appreciate that timing.
On the weekends or on Fridays, hopefully by midday on Friday. So people, maybe they're heading out of town for the weekend, they can drop it in, listen to about 25 minutes of us talking about education and education politics.
Well, I think it's a great idea, and sorry that Clark has gone off to new horizons, but we're excited for what he's doing, and I know that
really
your
podcast for him. And as we've said on the podcast, we'll have Clark back from time to time to break down politics as he covers it on his new venture.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for all that you're doing for education news in the state of Idaho and covering those coronavirus case numbers so closely, whether it be K-12 or on the college campuses. And I'm so excited for your new project that's coming out. This is all just good stuff at a time when things are looking good in Idaho. So yay. As Susan said, woohoo. I will go back to that.
Here's hoping. Here's hoping.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, for making the grade. Have a great week.